I forget which author it was, Claire Lewis, or I forget who it was, who said it's awfully hard to persuade someone of something when his livelihood depends on him not understanding it.
It might only be a paraphrase of Upton Sinclair's famous quote, but if there's a more apt summary of the debate over Christian nationalism, you'd be hard-pressed to find one. So what happens when one nation under God becomes one God over a nation? That's essentially the question at the heart of the controversy surrounding Christian nationalism. What it is, what it isn't, and who exactly stands to benefit from such a movement. Is it everyday American Christians in the pews? Or is there some other agenda at work? For Idaho minister and theologian Doug Wilson, whom commentator Tucker Carlson has called the, quote, Christian nationalist they warned you about, says it all boils down to who or what is the object of worship.
I don't want to be living under a deity that could have as its titular representative Joe Biden. That's not the God I want to live under. And consequently, there's no getting away from that, regardless of which way you feel. I could be arguing with a liberal next door neighbor, and he doesn't want to live under a deity, the head of which is Donald Trump. Okay? But the only way out of that dilemma is to have a transcendental reality that is recognized and acknowledged in the immanent realm. If we don't recognize a transcendent reality, then we're locked in a room that's got an 8-foot ceiling that goes on forever and ever. And it's simply suffocating.
If you're a regular consumer of mainstream American media, then you've likely heard the argument that Christian nationalism poses the biggest threat to the 2024 election.
I'm a Christian against Christian nationalism.
I'm a Christian against Christian nationalism.
I'm a Christian against Christian nationalism.
I'm a Christian.
I'm a Christian.
I'm a Christian.
I'm a Christian.
Beginning on or around January 6, 2021, and continuing all the way through the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump on July 13th, 2024, the phrase Christian nationalism is now commonplace, at least among most mainstream media outlets, even though a March 2024 Pew survey found fewer than half of all U.S. adults said they have ever heard or read anything about Christian nationalism. Following the Dobbs decision and accelerating under efforts in states like Oklahoma and Louisiana to allow the Bible to be taught in classrooms and mandating the display of the Ten Commandments in public schools, those on the political left have accused politically active Christians of seeking to establish a state-sponsored religion. In fact, in the wake of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump at a campaign rally in Pennsylvania in July, multiple media outlets linked Christian nationalism to the shooting, including Politico, which ran a July 21st editorial with a headline referring to the Trump shooting as mobilizing a, quote, insurgent group of evangelical Christians. Other outlets linked the belief that God intervened in the shooting with Christian nationalism ideology, which Wired described as a, quote, distinct political tendency which envisions the United States as a divinely ordained promised land for Christians of European descent, end quote. Despite its use as a pejorative among most mainstream media outlets, the label of Christian nationalist has been embraced by a number of high-profile evangelical leaders, including theologian Al Mohler and Republican lawmakers like Marjorie Taylor Greene.
We have the left
routinely speaking of me and of others as Christian nationalists, as if we're supposed to be running from that. I'm not about to run from that.
We need to be the party of nationalism, and I'm a Christian, and I say it proudly. We should be Christian nationalists.
It's even been the subject of a Rob Reiner-produced movie, God and Country, which claimed to examine the, quote, implications of Christian nationalism and how it distorts not only the constitutional republic, but Christianity itself, end quote.
I think it's important that we point out we're not trashing Christianity with this film. It's the exact opposite, because what we have is we have very prominent conservative Christian leaders speaking out against Christian nationalism because they think it undermines the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Christianity and the church. They see Christian nationalism not only as a danger to democracy, but as a danger to Christianity itself.
It's a movie which, despite speaking to evangelical leaders who all aligned in their opposition to Trump and all things MAGA, purported to define Christianity itself.
I'm a Christian nationalist. I have nothing to be ashamed of because that's what most Americans are.
Is Christian nationalism Christian? No, it isn't.
While Reiner's film ultimately flopped at the box office, the film, which has been described as everything from weighty and timely to alarmist and bland, only served as a cinematic symbol for the onslaught of cable news programming warning their viewers about Christian nationalism. With menacing lower third graphics like Theocracy Rising and Threat of Christian Nationalism, some of the world's biggest media outlets have turned this alleged specter of an evangelical takeover into regular segments. NBC News and its cable TV counterpart MSNBC have perhaps been the most vocal, at times even overtly hostile, in their definition of Christian nationalism. CBS News produced a special report called An Uncivil War, which ominously warned of a, quote, extreme faction of evangelical Christians who the report described as posing a potential threat to American democracy, and specifically linked this threat to white evangelicals.
Christian nationalism is a worldview that experts say is largely held by white Christians, whose goal is to structurally increase their power and influence.
MSNBC, which has published nearly 600 articles, videos, and other pieces of content focusing on the phrase Christian nationalism, has even gone so far as to equate it with white supremacy, with one host saying Christian nationalism is based on the, quote, myth that America was founded as a Christian nation, end quote, and branding it as an effort to turn this country into a theocratic state. The network routinely highlights anti-Christian nationalism activists like University of Pennsylvania's Chair of Religious Studies, Anthea Butler, the author of White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, to speak on what she says is a distinctly white evangelical problem.
Let me say about Christian nationalism, first of all, it's a belief that the founders and the framers wanted this to be a Christian nation. But more than that, what white Christian nationalism is saying is that they want white people to be in power, that they are the ones who have the true Christianity, and that if you accede to what they want, especially white male leadership, then the country will be safe. The country will be in the right hands. And I think that part of this has to do a lot with our history. I talk about this in my book, White Evangelical Racism, about how white evangelicals especially thought that they were the ones who were able to bring God into this nation. And so when you hear talk from people like the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and others talking about America as a Christian nation, what they're also saying to you is that they want white men to be part of that leadership in this Christian nation.
What led so many faithful Christians to see a profane, self-absorbed, twice-divorced reality TV star as a divinely inspired leader is an important question. The religious right has been around for a long time, but this kind of political expression of religion, one not separate from but intimately connected to government.
The Christian Post reached out for comment from both CBS News and MSNBC for their Christian nationalism content and any potential role of influence or inspiration they may have played in the Trump shooting, but neither outlet responded to a request for comment. Despite MSNBC and other networks' claims that Christian nationalism is a distinctly white evangelical phenomenon, a February 2024 study by the left-leaning PRRI found majorities of two religious groups hold Christian nationalist beliefs: white evangelical Protestants at 66% and Hispanic Protestants at 55%. The survey also found little variation in support for Christian nationalist beliefs by race or ethnicity alone, with roughly 3 in 10 white Americans, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and multiracial Americans all qualifying as Christian nationalists, according to the survey. For its metric of Christian nationalism, PRRI used a battery of 5 questions about the relationship between Christianity, American identity, and the U.S. government, and asked respondents to weigh in on whether they agree with each of the following statements. Quote, the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. And God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society, end quote. And yet, some may be surprised to learn that as a matter of discourse, we don't really have a consensus on what the term Christian nationalism actually means. Executive Director of the Center for Litigation at America First Policy Institute, Mike Berry.
I don't think that there's a legal definition. And even if there were a legal definition, I think the term has really taken on a life of its own. It's been used, if you want to say it's been weaponized, I think, by the left as a bit of a dog whistle. Everybody agrees that the United States is not a theocracy. Anyone who studied the founding of our nation knows that it was a marvel of the world at the time, the way that our founders established our republic. We have a democratic republic, and the power resides in we the people. It's not a monarchy. It's not a theocracy. So, like I said, when people use the term Christian nationalism, I'm not even sure exactly what they mean. I think some people look at it purely as those who believe that the United States was founded on Christian principles. Well, if that's your definition, that's absolutely the truth. The nation was founded on Christian principles. There's no way that anybody can deny that. But if you use the term Christian nationalism to mean that the United States is a theocracy or should be a theocracy, I think you'd find very, very little support for that, even among those who would describe themselves and identify themselves as people of faith.
Others, like Dr. James Spencer, author and theologian with the D.L. Moody Institute, says defining such a broad term will, by necessity, require nuance and precision.
There's different species of Christian nationalism. And one of the ways that I've sort of tried to differentiate this is Christian nationalism that I view as problematic and theologically problematic for the church particularly is Christian nationalism that seeks to fuse Christianity with the state. And so there is a desire for Christians to actually run the government, not just participate in government. We're not talking about folks running for office or voting or anything like that. But for Christianity to be the reigning philosophical and theological framework through which the state is then operated. That to me is Christian nationalism. It's that fusion of Christianity and the state.
And that objective, Spencer says, just isn't found in the Bible.
When we look at Scripture, we see a distinction between the church and the state. We see that God has established the church. And we also see that God has delegated authority to governing authorities, which in our context is, the state and federal governments. And so that distinction in Scripture is actually quite clear. The church is not set up to operate as the state. It's not set up to exercise the state's political power. It is to be a people apart, demonstrating and witnessing to Jesus Christ, and offering, obviously, theological critique of the state and its operations, But ultimately, we are not set up to reign. We're not set up to rule. We are here to serve God. We are here to point to and magnify Jesus Christ. And so I think that collapsing the distinction between the church or Christianity and the state is biblically problematic.
For Wilson, it's all about acknowledging a divine king who, despite the whims of any given election cycle, stands sovereign over the political affairs and the governments of men.
So basically, if there is no God above the state becomes God. And if the state, comprised of human beings, is God, one of the things we know about human beings is that they're fallen and corrupt, and they change all the time. The transcendent God is holy, 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 and he never changes. So consequently, there's a sure footing. We can say for the Aztecs to sacrifice humans, for some primitive tribe to throw virgins into volcanoes, we can say that that's wrong. I don't care what culture you grew up in. I don't care what day of the week it is. I don't care what century it is. God will judge that at the last day because God is transcendent, never changes. But we change all the time. Sometimes we're cool with throwing virgins into volcanoes. Other times we disapprove of it mightily. But if you just wait a couple of years.
While the controversy over the semantics of Christian nationalism may feel like an academic exercise to some, this debate actually stretches back to the roots of the United States of America, the founding fathers, and documents of our nation. John Adams, the second president of the United States, in a letter to Thomas Jefferson on December 25th, 1813, wrote, "I have examined all religions as well as my narrow sphere, my straitened means, and my busy life would allow. And the result is that the Bible is the best book in the world. It contains more philosophy than all the libraries I have seen." Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president of the United States, wrote, "A thorough knowledge of the Bible is worth more than a college education." Patrick Henry, the famous Virginia orator and patriot of the American Revolution, said, "The Bible is worth all other books which have ever been printed." Herbert Hoover, the 31st president of the United States, wrote, "The whole inspiration of our civilization springs from the teachings of Christ and the lessons of the prophets. To read the Bible for these fundamentals is a necessity of American life." And Andrew Jackson, that hero of the Battle of New Orleans and the 7th president of the United States, said in regards to the Bible, "That book, sir, is the rock on which our republic rests." And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, on the 400th anniversary of the printing of the English Bible, said this, "In the formative days of the Republic, the directing influence the Bible exercised upon the fathers of the nation is conspicuously evident. We cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning with the place the Bible has occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic. Its teaching, as has been wisely suggested, is plowed into the very heart of the race." End quote. Outspoken Christian nationalists like evangelical author and historian David Barton often point to February 29th, 1892, when the U.S. Supreme Court declared in the case Holy Trinity v. United States that the historical record of America demonstrates that the U.S. is, quote, "a Christian nation."
Did the Founding Fathers actually believe that Christian principles were to be the basis of American government? The Supreme Court thought so, and that's why in that 1892 case, Church of the Holy Trinity versus United States, they spent time in the founding era, the era of the Revolution, to show the spirit of the American Revolution, to show the spirit of the documents of the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence. They showed very clearly and very convincingly that the Founding Fathers, by their acts during the Revolution, intended for Christian principles to be the basis of our government.
In fact, Wilson has suggested in the past that if the political will existed, the Supreme Court, for example, would merely need to reaffirm and reboot its Holy Trinity decision in order to officially declare America to be a Christian nation. But even if such a move were politically feasible, that doesn't mean it would address the deep-seated contention of what exactly Christian nationalism means, and might actually heighten an already strained political climate.
And this is where I go back to the point of there is no political solution. I don't think a president, no matter how charismatic he was, could make that happen. And I don't think a Supreme Court could make that happen. I think it would simply precipitate a civil war or a revolt. In order to make a decision like that, a gutsy decision like that, there has to be a major cohort of the people with you. Let's say you knew that 75% of the American people would be cool with a reboot of the Holy Trinity case of 1892. Let's say 75% of us would be good with it. It would still require an act of courage on the part of the magistrate to do something like that, or the Supreme Court to do something like that. And so consequently, I don't think that Christians in politics, on the court or in the executive or in the legislature, have an obligation before God to go over the cliff with their purity flags flying, right? There is an all or nothing mentality that frequently surfaces in conservative circles and on the right, where they've seen so many incrementalist attempts misfire or slide backwards, or ostensibly conservative congressmen going native. They've seen that enough times that they say, okay, we've had it. No more negotiating, no more Mr. Nice Guy. It's all or nothing. We'll shut down the government. We'll do everything. And that's just not fruitful. That's not how the world works.
I was an undergraduate at an evangelical college in the early to mid 1970s, from 1972 to 1976. And I remember very clearly when Jimmy Carter came on the scene, and I was just stunned.
Historian Randall Balmer, an Episcopal priest and professor of religion at Dartmouth College, says leading the nation as a Christian doesn't always have to equate to the establishment or proclamation of a Christian nation. Balmer says he vividly recalls former President Jimmy Carter boldly sharing his faith publicly without ever going as far as declaring America to be a Christian nation.
Here was a born-again Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher talking unabashedly about his faith and being born again. I mean, that's what we used to describe ourselves, of course. But we always did so in kind of furtive ways because, we knew it wasn't terribly popular in the larger society. But he was unabashed about that. And I remember it was a revelation, if I can use that term, that somebody who was being taken seriously as a candidate for president was talking about his faith and how his faith informed his politics, which he did copiously during the 1976 presidential campaign.
Still, says Balmer, Carter was careful to acknowledge what Balmer described as enduring Baptist traditions like the separation of church and state.
Jimmy Carter himself was a Baptist, and he was a good Baptist, meaning that one of the foundations of Baptist tradition, going back to Roger Williams, is liberty of conscience and the separation of church and state. And Jimmy Carter was a very good and faithful Baptist on that particular issue, especially. And he was very careful not to impose his religious views on the nation. Now, he had, and he has, very, very strong religious principles and convictions that certainly informed his politics and his policies. No question about that. But he was always careful to couch that in terms of democratic principles.
While it might be shocking for some, the now ubiquitous and often interchangeable phrases of Christian nationalism and Christian nationalists are relatively new terms. According to Google Trends, apart from a small spike in 2004 during the George W. Bush administration, usage of the phrase Christian nationalism remained at or near zero between 2004 and January 2021, around the time of the riot at the U.S. Capitol. Likewise, usage of the phrase in news searches remained at zero between 2008 and 2022, according to Google. Some media figures like Tucker Carlson have suggested the term Christian nationalism has risen to national prominence in part as a means to make Christianity and specifically white evangelicals, appear as a threat to average Americans.
The main thing Biden is going to run against is Christianity. Running against Christianity. He's already put people in prison for praying, so it's not a stretch. But of course, you're not going to say I'm running against Christianity, the world's largest religion. You're going to say I'm running against something called Christian nationalism, which was a way of making traditional Christianity seem like a threat to the country rather than the principle upon which it was founded. So that is their plan. They're going to run against something called Christian nationalism.
They hate Hungary. And they hate it not because of what it's done, but because of what it is. It's a Christian country, and they hate that. And that's the truth. And nobody wants to say it, but it's true. And it's not a particularly provocative Christian country. I don't think most Hungarians go to church. It's not a theocracy. You're not required to believe in the catechism to live here. It's nothing like that. It's a soft Christian country, the softest ever. 300 years ago, people would look at modern Hungary and say, that's not a Christian country. But by modern standards, it's one of the last countries that identifies as a nation built on Christian precepts. Again, not imposing them on anyone else. But that is enough to incite our policymakers in the United States. And that is exactly why they hate Russia, by the way.
Pastor Vodi Basham has also said he believes Christian nationalism is intended as a pejorative term against Christianity at large.
This term has been really difficult to define, and that's been intentional. The reason it's been difficult to define is because the term is meant as a pejorative. Again, people are arguing that this idea is something that is new, something that is made up, something that we're forcing, for example, on America and on America's history. But you can only believe that if you're ignorant of who came here and established America and why. For example, the Mayflower Compact.
Pastor John MacArthur, meanwhile, has argued against the biblical support for Christian nationalism, saying, quote, there is no such thing as Christian nationalism.
There is no such thing as Christian nationalism. The kingdom of God is not of this world. Jesus said that. He said, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight. His kingdom is not of this world.
And then there's Donald Trump. For most of the mainstream media, Trump's rise to political power paved the way for the emergence of Christian nationalism, with some issuing dire warnings about a potential second Trump administration.
Some of former President Trump's closest allies are planning to infuse, quote, Christian nationalism and their ideas into that administration if, in fact, the former president secures a second term.
One of those alleged efforts is part of something called Project 2025, a collection of conservative and right-wing policy proposals from the Heritage Foundation, which critics say could be an effort to reshape the U.S. federal government and consolidate executive power should the Republican nominee win the 2024 election. Among other things, Project 2025 calls for withdrawing approval for the abortion pill, banning pornography, slashing corporate taxes, abolishing the Department of Education, replacing thousands of experienced federal workers with political appointees, imposing a, quote, biblically based definition of marriage and families, and placing the Justice Department and other independent agencies under the direct control of the president. While Trump has disavowed any knowledge or involvement with Project 2025, that hasn't stopped critics like Robert Reich, who calls the project toxic.
I can see why Trump wants to distance himself from such a toxic plan. Page 5 calls for jailing teachers and librarians over banned books. Page 455 calls for abortion surveillance and stripping Americans of reproductive freedom. Pages 587 and 592 have plans to gut overtime pay rules. Page 489 demands the government prioritize, quote, married men and women over any other type of family. Page 371 proposes privatizing nuclear waste disposal.
Wilson says part of the reason for the semantic debate over Christian nationalism is because such discord actually serves a larger political interest.
The reason we don't have a common definition is because that would interfere with our tribal loyalties. If we settled on a common definition, we might get somewhere. And there are some people who don't want to get somewhere, right? So one of the humanistic assumptions is that we all want to make progress. Well, not everybody wants to make progress. Some people like it where they are. Some people have a vested interest in the status quo. Some people have a vested interest in changing the status quo. Some people have a vested interest in revolution. Some have an interest in reformation. Some have motives that are pure and noble. You've got the whole range. So yes, if someone made us sit in a room and hammer out a definition, I see a good deal of people talking past each other.
So what would Project 2025 or some similar agenda look like? Didn't we already see something like this in Trump's first term? Dr. Ralph Reed.
The late Chuck Colson said that we have to engage the culture, and one of the ways that we do it is through civic and political participation. And I think the political culture has changed. And certainly during the Trump administration, I talked to various officials who served in that administration, and they told me that they saw more faithful, devout Roman Catholics and born-again evangelicals serving throughout that administration, whether it was in agencies, cabinet departments, or in the White House, than all the previous administrations they had worked with combined. That's a huge change in our culture. It's not just a change in policy or politics, it's a change in the culture because, as Bill Bennett so eloquently said, the former Secretary of Education, the law is a teacher. The law is not just a matter of policy. It also sets the tone for a culture. It embodies the values and the aspirations of the people who are governed by those policies. So I think that's been a big change.
So can Christian nationalism be reasonably considered as extremist? Mike Berry says, whatever threat some may perceive from Christians becoming more politically engaged, an even bigger threat could arise from not just Christians, but all people of faith abdicating their right to make their voices heard.
I actually think the real danger is when people of faith, so it doesn't just have to be churches, it can be synagogues, temples, whatever the case might be. I think the real danger in our country is when people of faith stay home, when they don't engage civically. And obviously, when I say that, I absolutely mean to engage peacefully, right? To engage in the civic process and to use the processes that we have, the system of governance that we have. We can't let everybody just be a law unto themselves. But at the same time, the real danger, as I was saying, is when people of faith think that somehow they can't bring their faith into the political sphere. And that's when I think we start to see a lot of the things that we lament about our country today. Our founders absolutely believed and frequently wrote and spoke about the fact that you cannot separate civic virtue from morality, that religion and morality are indispensable supports, right, to having a nation that's going to flourish. Or as Alexis de Tocqueville famously said, America will cease to be great when she ceases to be good. What did he mean by that? He meant the source of America's power, whether it's economic power, political power, military power, is her morality. You can't ungird our morality from the religions that most of our founders were well versed in.
Meanwhile, Christian get-out-the-vote activists like Gina Gleason with Real Impact says Christians have got to get tough and not get tied down by the cultural name-calling.
Well, I've heard Christian nationalists be described in so many different ways, and I don't feel that we're any of those different things that are said about Christian nationalists. We are just people that realize that we have a right to defend what we believe. We believe that God created marriage, so we believe in traditional marriage. We believe that God created life, and from birth to natural death, God's in charge of who lives and who dies. We all have our day. I believe that God created them male and female. There's only two genders, and we want to stand for that. We believe that parents have the right to raise their children according to their own values. So we want to say in how the schools expose our children and teach our children different things. And I don't know what that is called other than it's just a traditional Christian who has traditional biblical values. And that's what we want to see. And I think that everything that we are doing and saying, I think it benefits everyone, whether or not a person is a Christian or not. If we're saying that there's male and female and that's it, two genders, that benefits everyone.
So what fruit can we expect Christian nationalism to bear in 2024 and beyond? Dr. James Spencer says there are some in the church who may be seeking to fuse the pulpit with the state.
If you look at Christian nationalism carefully and understand what it's actually saying and what it's actually doing, I think an argument can be made that it is diminishing the church. There is a movement now that's saying that Christianity needs the power of the state. And it needs the power of the state so that it can fix the world. But I would tend to argue that our role as Christians is not to fix the world. We do not glorify God simply by fixing the world. We glorify God by living faithfully in a world so broken only God can fix it. So Christian nationalism, yeah, I think it's problematic on that level. It's going to pick up all of the problems that the political system has inherently. And those being polarization, discord, argumentation, the bad forms of debate, as opposed to standing apart, being the church, speaking theologically into it, participating in government. Like I said, I'm not anti-participationist, right? I'm not arguing that the church should be isolated from the culture. I'm not arguing that the church never should participate in politics. But I think we have to be very careful about arguing for the fusion of Christianity with the state.
A witness to Jesus Christ. Whether Christian nationalism is a legitimate threat or a manufactured slur for politically active Christians, being a witness for Jesus is something everyone in the church can aspire to in 2024 and beyond.